Hi there my friends, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today we're going to be looking at Chromacolour liquid acrylics. Chromacolour recently reached out to me and sent me a selection of 50ml bottles of their liquid acrylics. To begin with, I swatched them out. I wanted to see how they worked, their opacity and how translucent they were, and they worked out really well on the swatch sheet. So the next thing I did is I sketched out a little duckling from some reference images I'd got at home, applied them to the piece of paper, applied the sketch that is, and it's a Fabriano Artistico 100% cotton hot pressed watercolour paper. I did stretch it onto a board, stapled it down so I knew I wouldn't have any buckling. Taped it down with acid-free washi tape, and as I said, I'm going to be using the Chromacolour liquid acrylics and brushes by Rowney. That's their System 3 brushes, and for the detailing I'm going to be using a Royal & Langnickel Crafter's Choice No. 1, a really cheap and cheerful little brush that does the job. So to begin with, I'll just tell you a little bit about these paints. Obviously, as you can see on the video at the moment, I applied water to the paper and then applied the pigment like you would with a watercolour. Now the great thing about these liquid acrylics is you can use them straight from the pot, so you can use them like a traditional gouache or a traditional acrylic. You can add a little bit of water, use them like an ink. You can add more water and use them like a watercolour or run them through an airbrush. Or you can even add things like a gel thickener, so you can use them for impasto techniques. You can add retarders to extend the drying time if you don't like the quick drying time of acrylics so much. So there's lots of things you can do with these acrylics. You can sort of bend them to fit your needs, so to speak. So again, looking at the video, I've wet this area with clean water. So it's deionized water, the kind you buy to put in car batteries. So there's no chemicals in it to interfere with what I want the paints to do. I need to see how the paints work for me and if I can get them to do what I want them to do. And that's always the same when trying out a new medium or a medium you're familiar with but by a different manufacturer. Get them to work for you is the main thing. You can see them work for other people, but working for your techniques can sometimes be different. So I did, as I said, I did a little swatch sheet, but I just like to jump in with an actual project, and that's what I'm doing here. So again, I'm wetting the paper first, then allowing the pigments to move about on the surface of the paper. Now, I didn't use any retarders or anything. For me, even though I was told I could, for me I just wanted to see what the acrylics were going to do and if it's going to be a suitable medium for me moving forward when I want to work on projects with acrylics. Now, I know a lot of people like working on canvas with acrylics, and if I'm using a traditional sort of heavy body acrylic, then I do like to work on a canvas. But I also like to use my acrylics on paper, and some acrylics work fine, some don't. These proved right from the very beginning that it's a beautiful medium to use on paper. Now, the qualities of these acrylics, they're very, very highly pigmentated. Apparently you can thin them down with water to 1% paint, 500% water. So that is an amazing consistency you can get with these and still have pigment. They're very, very highly pigmentated, and that's something to keep in mind. A little bit goes a long, long way. So I'm just removing, while the paper's wet, just removing a little bit of the pigment with a cotton tipped thing. I don't know what you call them. Q-tips, I think they're called in America. These aren't the plastic ones. These are completely paper, so they're recyclable. In between these layers, I did dry the paper with a hairdryer. I wanted to make sure that was all settled and the paint wasn't going anywhere after that. They are light fast. The whole range is light fast. and they were actually developed for use in the animation industry. So they dry flat matte, so there's no shine at all. Perfect if it's something you want to work with and then photograph afterwards, so you don't get any glare. And obviously reproduction wise, that's great if you're going to be making prints and things like that. So mixing all of the paints in a little porcelain plate, porcelain paint palette that's next to me on the desk while I'm working. Pretty boring to look at, so I didn't want to include that. I just want to show you the project in process. So I mixed up a little bit of paint, and as I said, a little bit goes a long way, and I was really surprised. The little bottles, you just need one tiny droplet of paint onto your palette and it just goes on and on and on, and as long as you keep spraying it so it doesn't dry out, you use very little paint. I mean, I've not touched really the amount in these bottles for a whole painting. It's not noticeable at all. So I think they're running at about £5 or £6 a bottle on Chromacolour website, and wow, I mean, that's going to last you a lifetime really, especially if you're just doing small projects like this. So again, I added a little bit of water, and that is burnt sienna that I'm adding there. The colours are very pure, so there's no pigment information on the bottles themselves, but I'm sure the company would supply pigment information if you needed it. But the colours mixed with each other very easily. I didn't make mud at any time, so I'm assuming it's very pure pigments that are in the bottles. I hope everybody's keeping well. So yeah, as I said, letting the layers dry in between. Now going on with a burnt umber mix and just defining the shape. Now, because these are acrylics and they do dry completely between layers, once they're there and you've dried them with a heat tool or a hair dryer, they're not going to move. So if you like lifting your paints, then you'd want to use them as a watercolour and work into them quite quickly if you're used to lifting paint. But if you're used to working with acrylics and you like the layers underneath, once they're down, they're sort of down for good, then these are a great paint too. Here's that little brush I was talking about, the Royal and Langnickel #1. It's just called Crafter's Choice. It is literally just for card making and things. It's a really cheap brush with a soft grip. But you know, you get about 12 brushes for £8 or something, and they're just really good brushes. I really didn't know what this paint was going to be like, so I wasn't prepared to use my most expensive watercolour brushes. So I just picked these up and they do the trick. Brilliant. Do the job. Okay, so I've applied the base coats and I'm working up more detailed coats now. With the plan of what I want to do is use glazes. I want to see how these paints are going to be able to glaze for me, and you'll see later on in the video that they glaze brilliantly. They're very vibrant because they're so highly pigmented, so even when you're thinning them down to a very weak consistency, the vibrancy is still there, and that's amazing. So I've mixed a little bit of a reddish tone. I'm not going to tell you the colours I use because you really don't need to know the colours, and to be quite honest, I was mixing the different pots together and just making my own colours out of these pots that they'd sent to me. So some of them are just, you know, mixes I've made in the palette. So going on with a reddish tone, building up some more details, and all of this is going to be glazed over. So it's just to add depth. This is just how I work. I'm completely self-taught. I like to build my acrylics up like this as I do my watercolours. And if you've seen any of my other videos, I tend to generally use all my mediums in the same way. unless it's oils, then I generally work dark to light. But acrylics, you'll see me work dark to light and light to dark during this video. As I said, the paints mix really well. Adding white builds the opacity of a colour. That's another thing. Have some people asking about wanting more videos of acrylics. I've had people now asking for botanical pieces too, which is something I used to do quite a bit of, is botanical work. When you're working with these colours, I've found that, well, generally speaking, if you're going to apply a glaze, you don't want to apply white. But if your colour's too dark, then just add water, because that will thin it down. It will change the hue, lighten the hue until you get a glaze that's going to be light enough for your needs. The minute you start adding white, your glaze becomes misty. That's fine if that's the look you need. But if you're looking for a clear glaze and you just want to tint the colours underneath, because that's what a glaze is, then don't add water. Sorry, don't add white. You need to add water. Just water the paint down. And as I said, these paints, you can just keep adding water, keep adding water. You'll change the hue, but you won't lose the colour, if that makes sense. So all of this is going to be glazed over. When you know you're going to be glazing over some detailing work that you're doing, make sure that that layer is dry. I mean, these paints, they do dry very fast. They were drying fast on the palette, so I was spraying them with water to keep them workable. Drying very fast on the paper. I'm not sure if they dry as fast if you're working on a canvas, but working on this paper, they did dry fast. So that is something just to keep in mind. If you're, as I said, if you're used to lifting paint while you're working, then you might want to add a retarder to these paints if you're working on paper, because of the speed of drying. Going on a little bit more detail. I think this video is running for about 45 minutes. I hope everyone's keeping well. Thank you to everybody who's been subscribing. We're over the 2,000 mark now, so I'm looking into doing a giveaway. I'll be coming up with a video regarding that really soon, and everybody that's subscribed will be able to enter for a free print. I think it's going to be a print, and it will be worldwide. It won't just be the UK. I'll do a print to order for the winner, but I'll do a separate video about that. So here's a little bit I kept in for you. So I didn't edit this bit out. People ask a lot about tracing. Is it okay to trace? And yeah, if whatever gets you creative. But the thing is, if you're going to trace your drawings, make sure you do practice your freehanding as well, because there will be times in your artistic journey when tracing just won't do it. And here I wanted to define the eye, so I'd lost it a little bit with the paint going on, and I just needed to get that eye back in, make sure I've got the right shape, so I needed to freehand that. And if you're solely reliant upon tracing images to paint or tracing images to draw and colour in, you're not going to be exploring the creativeness that you've actually got inside you, which is the drawing side of things. So if you're going to trace, make sure you practice your freehanding too. And as I said, people are asking me to do botanical now, as well as animals and birds and things. So there will be some botanical works coming up, and that's great for beginners, because if you get the shape of a petal wrong, or you get you miss one petal out of a flower, or you put an extra petal in, nobody's going to notice. It will still look like a flower. Whereas if you got the anatomy wrong on a bird or a mammal or reptile or amphibian, then people are going to notice a little bit more. You'll notice that a little bit more. So flowers can be much more forgiving for beginners. So I'm hoping that by doing some botanical work, especially in watercolours, or these liquid acrylics would work great as well, then that's something that beginners might find a little bit more comfortable practicing. So back to this painting. As I said, mixed up sort of a dark burnt real umber, for this, and just putting in the detail with this little brush. And these Crafter's Choice brushes by Royal and Langnickel are brilliant, so I do recommend them. I think you'd probably get them from a crafting shop or online, but it's you buy them in a pack. It's a massive pack. They're golden tackle on bristles, so they're quite springy. They hold the point because they're meant for crafting, and they hold a fair amount of pigment and water too. So great little brushes. If you don't want to spend, if you don't want to spend too much, you don't want to break the bank, but you want some decent brushes, I'd use these. I wouldn't use them for watercolour, but definitely use them with liquid acrylics. I'd use them with inks. You'd probably get away with using them with gouache as well. I wouldn't use them with more of a heavy bodied acrylic though, because the bristles are too short and the paint will get stuck up near the furrow of the brush. But great for liquid acrylics, definitely. So a little bit more detailing around the eye. And it's just things like this. I just wanted to concentrate on the head area so you could see how everything is built up. The layering system that I use. As you can see, the top of the head, I have gone in there in between the darker parts of detailing with the redder tone. And it's not a case of filling every little bit in. You still want to leave some of the paper showing through, and it gives you that added depth. You don't want, the initial layers that I put down, like watercolour layers, you don't want to cover that completely, else there was no point in putting that in the first place. So when you're adding detail, you still want to be letting the colour of the underlying base coat show through, and that gives you the sort of that glow and depth that you want to achieve. You want your subject to look solid but not flat. I hope that makes sense, and letting all of the colours from the underneath layers come through, not covering them completely, gives you a lot of added depth to a subject. And make sure you keep your eye on where your shadows are and highlights. Sorry about that, was my phone going off. Over on MeWe. Don't know if anybody knows about MeWe, but it's a social media platform like Facebook, when Facebook used to be good. So skip forward a little bit there, more of the same. Now going in with a glazing colour. So all it is a colour that's a translucent colour. So you can use any colour to glaze with as long as it's not opaque. And obviously, as I said, don't add white because that will make sort of a misty effect to it, unless you're adding a misted effect. If you want to create an animal that's walking through a dusty area, then you can create a glaze and add some white, and it will give you that misty effect, and then you just apply that as a glaze. So that's a nice technique, and I'll probably show you that on a future video. If you do want any videos of particular mediums or subjects, don't forget to pop a comment in one of the boxes below the video. Please hit like and subscribe and share my videos, because it does help my algorithms apparently. And thank you to everybody for your emails and messages. It's just brilliant, so lifting, really is. Feel very blessed to be able to do this for everybody, and I hope everybody's staying safe and staying creative. Let's fill this world with beautiful things. So the red sort of is mixed up like a brick red colour, and that's adding a lovely glow. Then I added a little bit of yellow to it to make it a little bit warmer. So you're now looking sort of at an orangey colour, and adding that as a glaze too. And just mixing the two together. So I didn't want to do the whole area of the cheek in just one glaze. So I'm mixing it up a little bit of red here, a little bit of yellow here, a little bit of orange in between, and just alternating, keeping my eye all the time on my reference images though. So people have asked me, several people actually, how much do I look at a reference image? And it's quite a lot of the time, and I did read up on it, and some artists who have been like classically trained artists, if that's the right saying, actually say that, you know, looking at the reference image 80% of the time and working for 20% of the time is what they're taught in art schools. Learn something new every day. I didn't go to art school, so I'm completely self-taught, but it does make you wonder, because we do it without even thinking, I guess. But I do, when I'm teaching, especially in person, I do encourage people to study the reference image a lot more than they think they should, because it does help. Or your imagination takes over, and you know, your brain will start thinking, oh, I know how to draw an eye, I don't need to look at the reference image, and then you know, you might go off a little bit on your painting or your drawing. So leaving the head as it is for now, can come back in once it's all nice and dry, and applying some wet on wet. Wet on wet is simply adding pigment to paper that's already got water on it, or adding pigment to paper or canvas that's already got wet paint on it. So literally wet on wet. You're adding a wet medium to a surface that's already wet, either with paint or water. Obviously this stops you from getting hard edges when you're working wet into wet. Working wet onto dry is working a wet pigment onto dry paper, or a paper that you've painted and then it has already dried, and that way you can create hard lines. You can also go dry into dry, so adding a very dry brush, so adding pigment that's nearly dry onto a dry surface, and that way you can get quite a rough looking texture, because the dry pigment will just hit the ridges of the tooth of the paper, and that's called dry brushing. So lots of different things to try, but as I said, when I'm trying a new medium, or a medium that I've used before but by a different manufacturer, I just like to go straight in and create a project. I find I learn more about a medium doing it this way, and I definitely enjoy it a lot more doing it this way, by just working on a project, than I would working on little swatches and things. I do the colour swatch, but that's sort of run-of-the-mill, something I always do. But apart from that, I just like to jump in with this subject. How about you? If you're working or wanting to work with a new medium, do you like to play around in a little sketchbook with it, or do you just jump in and do a complete project? Just let me know in the comments below. I'd be interested to see and your ideas, and what mediums have you worked with that way, and what have you liked and what have you disliked? It'd be interesting to find out. Okay, so we're just working more wet into wet there. You can see when it's working wet into wet, because the pigment just spreads out that little bit, it just bleeds out that little bit, but it'll stop. The pigment will only bleed out as far as the wetted area. As soon as it hits an area where there isn't any water in the paper or on the canvas, the pigment will stop spreading, because it like hits a wall. So that's when you can get hard edge, and obviously the edge of the beak is a hard edge, and I want it to stop there. But if it was sort of midway across the beak and I hadn't wetted the whole beak enough, that I wouldn't want it to leave a hard edge there, so I'd have to quickly go in with a wet brush and just make sure I just softened that edge out. You don't want any hard edges where you don't want them, if you know what I mean. And because it's a permanent pigment, you wouldn't be able to lift that hard edge out, you just have to cover it up. That is one of the, I mean, some people call it a drawback, that the paint dries so fast, but because it's permanent, once it's on the paper it's permanent, you just go over it. So if you make any mistakes, just go over them, you know, your next layer. If you're unhappy with a layer, it means that layer isn't your final layer. You can layer on top. So if you're unhappy with a painting, just keep going, just keep adding layers until you get what you're looking for. Now the head is now looking quite vibrant, isn't it? And that's because of the added glazes with acrylic, and it is better seen in life, to be quite honest. With acrylics or anything where you're using glazes, the more glazes you have with each, right, let's take this back a step. Once you're putting your detail on, when you're putting detail on and the idea in your head is to glaze over the top, you want to make the detailing stand out. You want it to be a highly contrasted detail, because the more glazes you add on top, the less contrast of the detailing underneath. So but the best thing is, the more glazes, the more layers of glazing you have, the more there is for the light to refract through, and it gives you that added sense of vibrancy, that added sense of depth. But the initial detail layer needs to be highly contrasted so it could still show through those additional glazing layers. I hope that makes sense. Your glazes slightly blur out the contrast that's underneath. That's why the more glazes you add, the less detail you're going to see. You're still going to see it, but it's not going to be as contrasting as it is when you first put it down. But you need that. You need the contrast of the detail underneath. As you can see on this, the body of the duckling, I've just put the undercoats on, very watery undercoats, wet into wet, working it like a watercolour, working with a drier paint to put the detailing on. But that's quite a high contrasting detail, isn't it, with the base coats. And I need that high contrast because as I add the glazes on top, it's going to lessen the contrast of the detailed layer underneath. Oh my word, this is turning into 45 minutes of waffle, but I do hope you're understanding what I mean. There you can see some of the glazes have been added, so it looks more unified, I guess, but still with some of the contrast showing through. Now using the white, they sent me the chroma white. Using the white mixed in with other colours did give me an opacity I could work with. And first making sure that the layers underneath are dry. Obviously if the layers underneath are wet or damp, that's going to dilute the highlights that I'm trying to put on. So a quick blast of the hairdryer across the painting, making sure everything's dry, and then waiting for the paper to cool back down. Acrylics dry fast, and if you work on a warm surface, warm paper or a warm canvas, your acrylic will dry quicker, and that's definitely not what most people want. So dry your layers underneath, make sure they're completely dry, and then give the surface a few minutes to cool back down. I mean, you can touch it to see that it's cooled back down, and then paint if you want your to get the slowest drying time from your acrylics. That's a must, is to let your paper cool back down after drying. So we've gone over most of the chest area, the little wing area, adding highlights. Now that looks quite bright compared to the head, and the reason is I wanted to add highlights for glazing. So all glazing is tinting the colour that's underneath with a translucent glaze. So that's another thing people have been asking about, opacity and transparency. If something's transparent, you can see through it. So the window that I'm sitting next to, I can see through it, so it's transparent. Now if you were to tint that with say orange or yellow, but you could still see through it, then it has a translucency. So the amount you can see through is the amount of translucency. If something's opaque, if it's completely opaque, you can't see through it. If it's partially opaque, you can see through it a little bit, but it's still got sort of that milky blur about it. Now here's a perfect way of showing you what a glaze does. So all I'm doing, using a bigger brush to cover this area and working the paint quite quickly so I didn't get any hard edges as it's drying, is just working in a glaze. And see how it tints the pigment that's underneath, but you can still see the detail. Ideal thing with explanation, of a glaze is think of a stained glass window. You can still see through a stained glass window even though the panes of glass are coloured, and that's all glazing is really. You can still see through it, but you still want to be able to see through it and see the detailing and the tones underneath, but you're just tinting everything like a life looking through rose-coloured glasses, rose-tinted glasses. So just adding different glazes and working wet in wet. So once one glaze is down, once this glaze was down, I kept altering the glaze that's still left in my palette and working that into the glaze that's sitting on top of the paper and hasn't dried yet. And so lots of blended areas, soft edges and no hard edges. To do this you have got to work quite quickly though, because once that paint is dry on the paper it's there for good. You can't lift it. So working wet into wet with glazes, it's fun as long as you work prepared to work quite quickly. If not, you could just let one glaze dry and then add your next glaze on top. You can, because the paint is permanent, you can add one glaze, let it dry, then add water and add your next glaze, so you can get that wet in wet look. And obviously the water won't shift the paint that's underneath, because once it's down it's permanent. I want to say a huge thank you to Chromacolour for sending me the paints and allowing me to make this review video. They wanted the truth, warts and all, which is, I wouldn't give anything else anyway. If I'm prepared to use something in my artwork, then it needs to be able to work for me. Now you can see how opaque the white can be mixed with the other colours, making the other colours opaque. So I mixed sort of a yellow ochre colour for this. And it's just a beautiful pigmented paint. And I'm not saying that just because they sent me these samples. That it really is a lovely paint to work with. Now it's dried straight away. That's, this is speeded up to 150, but that dried quickly. So I tried to lift a little bit of it off. It wouldn't lift off. So I glazed over it. It went on a little bit too light in one area, so that's fine, just glaze over it. There you go. Glazes are wonderful, and I use glazes in nearly all of my mediums that I work with. You can glaze with pastel even, it is amazing what you can do. And it's, oh, that's clever, Kerry, painting behind your logo watermark, but you're getting the drift. So just add in some highlighted details that I want to glaze over later, and it just takes the pressure out of mixing the right colour for the right area. You can actually create paintings just from glazes. You could do the whole painting in black and white and then just glaze all your colours on top. So I know a lot of the old masters used to do that with in oils, and the name of that style of painting has slipped my mind at the moment, but that is a technique, and maybe I'll do that in a video in the future. And people have been asking for oil paintings as well, so I will be doing some oil paintings. I've just finished 2 commissions and one of them was huge, so that's why there's been a delay in this video coming out. So I just needed to, my bank manager likes me doing commissions because I get some money back into my accounts. But yeah, if I've got commissions on the go, I will always let you know on social media or via my YouTube channel community page, just to let you know why there's a little delay in the next video coming out. And it's normally that. It's normally that I'm working on works that I can't film really, which is a shame. But yeah, the big commissions have to come first, I'm afraid. But I'm back to YouTube now, so that's good, till the next commission comes in. I've also been approached about illustrating a book for an international bird book. Well, it's a bird book of the Arabian states, so that would be interesting if that comes off. But I will make sure that I can video those works in progress. Okay, back to the little duckling. So I've mixed up sort of a creamy colour here, and you know, I'm not cutting any of this out. Those layers that I've just applied underneath, they dry really quick. So I'm able to put these highlights on top, and all this will be glazed as well. So it won't look quite as harsh, I guess, as it is doing now. Just softening those edges down before they completely dry, and then getting them ready for the next glazing layers. And yeah, using this little tiny brush the whole way through that worked out at less than £1. So yeah, I think, I'm not sure, but I think you can get them from Hobbycraft and The Range here in the UK. But Royal and Langnickel, I know they sell internationally. So it's just a little bunch of brushes with soft grip handles, and they're called Crafter's Choice. So yeah, they're brilliant. They do the job. A little bit more detailing, and I think it was more or less this point I put the reference image away because I just wanted to concentrate on what the paints were achieving for me, and I'm not saying this just because they sent them to me, but they did the job. They are brilliant liquid acrylics. I've worked with a lot of liquid acrylic inks before by different manufacturers, but this is the actual first time I believe that I've worked with, you know, a liquid acrylic. Excuse me. So that's the little duckling more or less complete. As you can see, his little body is nice and fluffy. Lots of glazes. I went quite dark in areas with the glazes as well, balancing out the contrast across the duckling. And then for the foreground, I literally got an old ruined oil painting brush, to be quite honest. It was sort of an imitation hog hair that had seen better days, and I just stippled. So all that is just putting the tips of the dry brush in dryish paint and then just stippling it on the paper to make a rough effect. Shows you the opacity of the white, the Chromacolour white. Yeah, just painted on top to get these daisy feeling flowers. They're not, I mean, this isn't a botanical work by any stretch of the imagination, but it gives you a rough idea what the paints can do, and that's what I wanted to achieve in this painting. This painting isn't scientifically correct. It's just a very quick project, a stylized project, so just to get a feel for the paints, and they work wonderfully well. So some glazing and stretching the opacity of the paints to see what they would do for me, especially the greens going over the brown of the duckling. I wanted to see how that worked fine. If you're struggling with the opacity of a paint going over a darker area, just apply white first to, you know, I could have done the blades of grass white and then painted the green on top. Didn't need to. They worked, you know, these work fine. Mixing different colours there, different tones, mixing it up, darks and lights, and just playing. Lots of coffee, mugs of coffee. You all know me well by now to know I like a coffee while I'm working. So yeah, mugs of coffee, listening to some podcasts, listening to some YouTube channel, blogs and vlogs and things, and just relaxing and enjoying the process. No pressure. There wasn't any pressure. Managing director of Chromacolour, who sent me the paints, you know, no colour, just let us know what you think. That was it, really. You know, if a company ever says to me, you've got to say this about our product, or you've got to say that about our product, or we only want you to review it if you're going to say positive things, then I won't work with that company. I need to be honest. I don't want to mislead anybody. If it's a product I wouldn't work with, then I would either not review it, or I would review it and just say, you know, this product does this, this and this, it doesn't do this, this and this, so I wouldn't work with it. But these Chromacolours, they're thumbs up all round. There were no negatives about these at all. They were very pigmentated. Obviously, I can't vouch for the light fast, but they are, you know, it's in all of the literature that they're fully light fast. The pigments were ground so finely that there were no lumps in the paints. Yeah, it's just smooth application, easy application, dry quickly, steadfast once dry, you know, they didn't move. Brilliant, yeah. And I don't know how they've done it, but some people who don't like working on paper with acrylic is because it dries the paint out. Obviously, the paper surface is going to absorb the water out of a paint. Sometimes that can leave you with a chalky effect, especially with cheap watercolour paints. These acrylics, I don't know the chemistry behind it, but they applied beautifully. You know, the paper didn't seem to suck the water out of the paint or anything like that, weird or anything. Yeah, just beautiful to lay down, beautiful to layer with, beautiful to work with. And cleaned out of my brushes, oh, I'm a lazy artist, aren't I? Cleaned out of my brushes just with water. Didn't need to use any brush cleaner. Just rinse them under the tap with water. Yeah, brilliant. Out of my brushes, as though I've been working with watercolour or gouache. Perfect. There you go, a little bit of very, very transparent, translucent wash of pink. So I made a pink, watered it right the way down till there was just a tiny hint of colour in it, and applied it as a wash over those little daisy petals. In with a little bit of yellow ochre that I mixed up. I think I used the chroma yellow with the chroma white. Apparently the Chromacolours are the most opaque of the range. If you go on their website, there's loads of colours. I've got a leaflet here actually. How many? Oh, there's a lot. There's a lot of colours. Lots to choose from. And there we have him. Little duckling, mallard duckling, with Chromacolour liquid acrylics. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you've learnt something new today. I hope you'll give the Chromacolour liquid acrylics a try. Thank you for watching. Thank you for subscribing and clicking like. Please subscribe if you haven't already, and share with your friends and family, but don't spam them. Stay safe, people. Stay creative, and hopefully I'll see you all next week. Take care. Bye for now.